On this week's Carrier Wrap, we speak with Wireless 2020 to set the playing field ahead of the FCC's 600 megahertz incentive auction and discuss how much each participant is expected to bid and a timeline for the proceedings. Well, thanks for joining us in this week's Carrier Wrap. I'm your host, Dan Meyer, Editor-in-Chief here at RCR Wireless News. Joining me this week is Berge, Ayvazian, who's the Senior Analyst and Consultant at Wireless 2020 to talk about the upcoming 600 megahertz incentive auction. So, hey, Berge, thanks again for joining us. We appreciate it.
No problem, Dan. Nice to see you.
Yeah, great. Well, hey, again, I know we spoke a little while ago, kind of on the topic, but here we are now just days away from the auction. And then since we last talked, it did seem like the FCC came out with an actual list of forward auction bidders as well. So some more information has come out in the process. But I guess as we've kind of gone up to the process or up to the start date here, what's been, I guess, a general update from you or a general view of how it's kind of progressed, how the FCC has handled this kind of run up to the actual start now?
So, Dan, since I spoke to you last, I've been able to attend a couple of spectrum management conferences. And I spent some time talking to FCC officials about how it's going. And we've kind of moved along and conducted some more research about the process for 600 megahertz. So first of all, what you're alluding to is that on March 29th, the FCC has set the official start date for the incentive auction. But really, that is the reverse auction, where broadcasters will be selling spectrum to the FCC or to the auction process. And then we'll see later on the auction by the mobile operators where they're acquiring spectrum to unfold later on. But right now, next week's activity is focused on what are the broadcasters doing and how are the new television stations going to be repositioned after the auction.
Yeah, I guess how's that so far gone? It does seem like over the past couple of weeks, there's been a few comments, a few filings from some broadcasters. I think there's a court decision recently as well about one of the broadcasters involved in this. I mean, I guess what's been your general view of how kind of these last few weeks have gone in terms of getting broadcasters involved in this, and how has the FCC handled some of those, I guess, expected perhaps last minute challenges that have popped up?
Sure. Well, first of all, there's been a lot of anticipation for this week, and it's been all building up to this March 29th date, where we've already known that broadcasters had to file by January 12th in order to participate in the auction, but all that's been confidential up till now, so we really don't know what the broadcasters are doing except any comments they've made outside of the process itself. We also know that any station can withdraw from the auction and cannot choose not to participate. So next week, the broadcasters actually have to tell the FCC what they're doing, and that will tell what's really going to happen. There are about 8,500 television stations that own spectrum, and there are about 2,166 broadcast licenses that are eligible to participate in this auction. That's a large number. And inevitably, less than half of them will actually participate in the auction or come out the other side having actually sold their spectrum. Some of the biggest owners have already decided to participate, whether you're talking about CBS or NBC Universal owned by Comcast, or for that matter, Univision, which has a lot of Spanish broadcasters. And, these companies are opting to sell their airwaves, but they hope to continue broadcasting by being repacked and moved to other spectrum. There are some exceptions, of course. Many of the PBS TV stations that are on the UHF band have opted not to join the auction. And they're going to kind of let their fate be determined by the outcome. Even though there are potential for great returns, and they've done some calculations on what they could get if they were to participate, they figure it's their fiduciary responsibility to maintain their broadcast business. So they've kind of stayed out of the auction process so far. Now, one thing that's happened that's also very important is that a lot of these broadcast stations have been bought up by private equity companies in anticipation of this auction. And in particular, the ratios between what they've spent to buy these stations and what they expect to get a return has been called into question, as well as some of the practices they might engage in during the auction process. So it's kind of created this very interesting milieu of people debating whether the FCC is refereeing a get-rich scheme by some of these big private equity companies, or whether, in fact, they're really holding something that's in the public interest.
Very interesting to look at. I mean, obviously, I think, obviously you've been following this industry for long enough time to know that an auction can never happen unless there's some sort of controversy. And obviously, this does seem to be another one of those issues. I mean, again, spectrum is a very valuable commodity that we always find out. So interesting view on maybe what's happening out there. That's an interesting way to look at it.
Well, let me give you some specifics.
Sure.
There was a study published by the Wharton School of Business in University of Pennsylvania. And they looked at 3 private equity companies that have acquired some 39 stations over the past 2 years that they hope to flip in this auction. And they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars. For example, one of them is called NRG TV, which happens to be owned by Fortress Investment Group, a large investor company. They bought 40 licenses themselves, and they've spent $234 million for their stations. KSCI Channel 18 Independent was bought by them for $45 million. OTA Broadcasting, which you may know, is owned by and controlled by Michael Dell and his capital company. They acquired a bunch of television stations. And they expect to get as much as $4 billion out of the auction, and they invested less than $100 million so far in the stations they've acquired. So when you look at the activities that these companies can engage in, the Wharton School views this as an opportunity for them to kind of manipulate the system, to drive the price of the stations they sell up, and to reduce the cushion that the FCC has in terms of what buyers are willing to pay.
Yeah, that's just amazing. Yeah, I mean, I know you shared some of those numbers with me earlier as well. As I was looking through those numbers, I mean, it is just, it's mind-boggling and not frustrating, but it is just interesting to kind of see what's happening out there, what's happened over the past couple of years, even kind of the run-up to this auction. Again, I haven't seen these numbers put out by many other firms, so I would say definitely, if people want some more insight into this, definitely give Berge a call or check them out on email and kind of get some insight. But again, interesting numbers there. But I guess maybe looking past, I guess, that the television broadcaster part of this, what's your view on how long that part of the process will take, and when should we expect, I guess, the part that we're used to, kind of the more the forward auction part of it, and when do you expect that part to actually begin?
Well, first of all, we don't even know when it's going to start, much less when it's going to end. But let's take them in sequence, because we've kind of been looking at this backwards. We need to look at it from where we are now and going forward. So starting March 29th, we're expecting the reverse auction to take 3 to 4 weeks.
Okay.
And put us well into April, perhaps by the end of April, to complete the auction process for the broadcasters who are going to sell their spectrum. Now, the FCC has said they're going to take a break at that point, and what they need to do then is repack or reconfigure the spectrum with optimization software so that they can prepare for the forward auction. Obviously, they have to move the broadcasters from one end of the spectrum range to the other and consolidate them in order to make room for what they're going to sell. The FCC then will announce a clearing target. That is, how much spectrum they think has been freed up and that they can legitimately sell. And then they will provide a very detailed set of auction blocks that will then be up for auction. You know that they've already received applications from bidders. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then they will issue a final bidder list once they've received the payments, the upfront payments that are required from those bidders. And they hope they think they could provide as much as 126 megahertz. I'm doubtful about that. I think it'll be more likely to be around 80 megahertz when they're done. And we hope to get that done by the end of April, and then allow the clearing target to be announced in early May. That will set the forward auction process in motion, and we'll see how it unfolds starting in May.
Makes sense. Makes sense. And again, anybody who's seen the repackaging, some charts that I've seen at some of these conferences we've gone to, and if you've seen the charts and what the FCC needs to do in terms of repackaging, it is a very complicated process that they're going to have to do. And like you said, there's that little break period where they're going to have to figure out how to do all of this. And there's so many different levels to this, kind of things fall through the cracks and they have to restart again. And it's a very complicated process. And like you said, 80 megahertz probably sounds like the right number because, again, there are guard band issues. There are just so many interference issues. And then there's also the set-aside aspect. I know the FCC is going to try to have some spectrum set aside for, and we'll get to this part later as well, but what they've got to do over that little break area is going to be a complicated process. Again, I know they're professionals at this, but it's going to be a tough task for the FCC to kind of tackle all of that part of it.
Well, the good news is they've had a long time to prepare. And even though they are prepared, there's only so much you can do in advance. And there's more that you have to do once you've actually bought the spectrum back from the broadcasters. You know what you have, what your inventory is. And that's why it's expected that it'll take another 3 weeks or so, 3-4 weeks or so for the FCC to go through the repacking process. So that basically means that the month of May will be devoted to this break. So we'll have a break in the action in May, and we don't really expect to see the forward auction begin until June.
Okay. And then do you have, at this point, an expectation for a timeline for the forward auction part of it, do you think, or what's your general view of what we're looking at for that part of it?
Well, we expect that to take 3 to 6 weeks in and of itself. Sure. Assuming it starts in early June, it'll take us, well into July to see the results of the forward auction. And, we have some complexity there too. There were 104 applications that were filed that were viewed to be complete by the FCC. There are a whole bunch more, another 80 or so that were viewed incomplete, that have some homework to do to fix them, to get them back into good stead. Oddly enough, AT&T is one of the ones that filed an incomplete application. So I'm not sure what they left off, but they obviously have to fix that.
Yeah.
My point, though, is it'll be well into June and July before we're really into the heat of the forward auction.
Very interesting, very interesting. Well, I guess now you kind of mentioned the companies that are going to be involved in this, in the forward auction part of this. The list did come out recently about the companies involved. I guess what was your general view of the companies who are going to be part of this, and any surprises that popped up in that list? And obviously you mentioned the AT&T, their form not being complete, but again, we expect that to get changed here pretty quickly. I guess as you look at the list, any surprises there?
Well, the main surprise that I found was that literally the very majority, the largest majority of these filings were by people you've never heard of. Full names by, people who submitted an application. You have no idea who it is. You Google them. You have no way of knowing what that represents, who they represent, whether they're a lawyer, whether they are an engineer, consultant. It's hard to tell. So, more than half the applications were filed by these unknown entities that you'd have a hard time tracing back unless they decide to reveal what their intentions are and who they're representing. The other half represent the companies that we recognize and we would expect them to be there. Whether AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile USA, in some cases using a DBA, a front company with a different name. You have to kind of puzzle out who that is. Verizon is referred to as the Cellco partnership. Okay, so we understand that. And, when you continue down the list, maybe the most surprising thing is who's not on the list. Mm-hmm. So, Sprint some time ago said they didn't have the resources to participate in this auction. But a couple of weeks ago, the rumors started that their parent company, SoftBank, was forming an entity to participate in the auction. And, you know, between you and I, they very well could be there somewhere in some names that we have no idea who they are. But I haven't been able to find one that represents SoftBank. And they have not made any formal announcement that they are somewhere among those applicants. So, you know, we'll continue to work on that puzzle. But so far, I don't see SoftBank on there. And therefore, we would expect Sprint not to participate, even though they'd be eligible for the set-aside that you referenced that would give them some advantages in this auction.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you bring up a good interesting point there. It is always interesting to see the lists that come out, because you're right, it is just a bunch of names on there. And it always reminds me of, you know, I guess going back to the 80s when there was the initial auction or the Spectrum giveaway, basically. And people were going around and just filing out forms and sending their names in to get free Spectrum back in the 80s. And it seems like that's almost like a continuing part of these auctions. I mean, you always see these names of people. And a lot of the times it's the same names we've seen on these lists for years and years and years. I mean, a lot of these names you see and you're like, oh yeah, I've seen that name before. But you're right, it's a good point. You don't know who these people are, if they're really people. They rarely win anything. But, you know, occasionally you'll see someone pick up a license here and there, and sometime down the road they'll flip that license to somebody else and make some money. So that's an interesting point to always see the list when it does come out, how that always works.
Well, there are two factors that work in favor of these kind of entities that we don't know. One is that the geographic method of auctioning is very, very fine. They're very small areas, yeah. And there are lots of them. So you could have people bidding on, you know, small geographic areas and just not having to spend a lot of money, hoping to find the cracks in the system where, you know, they don't have to pay very much money and they get a territory. And perhaps they put up some toll booths there so that, you know, they can get paid as people want to use that spectrum. The other part of this is, you know, because of the set-aside, there is an opportunity for companies to be eligible for the set-aside. And, you know, you want to be a placeholder. You want to create the opportunity by filing an application that someone who's qualified for that set-aside would still be able to get their oar in the water at the time the auction actually starts. We do have a couple of months. So given that, you know, they have to get their filing in by a certain date, we'll know a lot more once we see the earnest money that people have to put up, and we have a better idea of what they're bidding on once we know how much auction spectrum is available. I should mention, too, that some of the other companies we are familiar with are the Tier 2 regional mobile operators, US Cellular, Ensight Cellcom, Citizens Wireless, C-Spire, which is called Cellular South. These are familiar names. They all have geographic areas in which they provide service, and it's logical that they'll bid on 600 megahertz within their territory or in and around their territory and take advantage of this auction just as they have in previous auctions. We also have Tier 3 rural operators that also have geographic areas that are going to pursue the auction in their regions, whether it's VTEL from Vermont or Chariton Valley Telephone Company, Sagebrush, Bluegrass, Union Telephone. These are all companies that have special needs in their rural areas. And for them, particularly the rural guys, 600 megahertz is way better than beachfront property. It's what allows them to economically cover the wide open spaces without having to put towers everywhere and without having to be densified. It's kind of the opposite of densification. So it gives them a real advantage as far as this type of spectrum is concerned. Now, the last groups that we probably should talk about are what people have called dark horses.
Yeah, definitely.
The ones that, you know, as you said, we're not expecting, we don't really know. We have investor groups that you can kind of puzzle out: Omega Wireless, Spectrum Financial Partners, Zephyr Spectrum Fund. These are companies that have raised money, that have put together capital, and are entering the auction on a speculative, in a speculative manner in order to participate and get a return on their investment. So, how many of them are there? Maybe some of these individuals are in that category. We don't necessarily know. But we certainly know they're out there. Columbia Capital has participated. And so, we're expecting them to have a financial play to both be able to buy low and then perhaps later on sell high.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think there was some talk last year. I think out of Silicon Valley, they came out as being I think Social Capital Rama Spectrum Holdings is their bidding entity, but they came out last year talking about they'd raised several $billions to participate and talking about actually wanting to be a carrier out there. Now, we've seen in the past a lot of these companies have made claims like that as well and bought spectrum, but never really done anything with it. But you're right. Yeah, the dark horse part is always interesting, and if you get some well-funded entities out there, they could have an interesting impact on these. And I'm guessing these guys are able to bid on the set-aside spectrum as well, which could be interesting because it might provide some competition for T-Mobile. For instance, T-Mobile is expected to be probably the bigger winner in terms of the set-aside, but some of these other entities could be an aggressive bidder in those bids, which could drive up some pricing at least, and maybe make T-Mobile spend more than it maybe wanted to spend when it began.
Well, you could always have you can impugn motives on people to say they're trying to drive up prices.
Sure.
Who knows? But if you do investigate some of these, that that's really not their intention. Social Capital, although it is a venture capital firm in the Valley, is really creating entities to do good things, to do positive things. And they've established a company, Rama, that in countries like Sri Lanka and Philippines are using very innovative techniques, working with partners like Google, the Google Loop project, where you have, basically things hanging in the air.
Yeah, big balloons. Yeah.
Hanging in the air to be the means of transmission. These are innovative methods, and you combine that with 600 megahertz spectrum, so they could change the economics of what mobile broadband service looks like. And, we're going to have to think out of the box, and I'll come back to timing, why I think that's really necessary. If we just think of 600 megahertz as an extrapolation of what we've done so far in the evolution from 3G to 4G, we're probably going to get this all wrong. The timing of it really puts it on the cusp between 4G and 5G. And that changes the dynamics here. But before we go to that, let's finish our list.
Yeah.
Know that, there were some expectations around Charter Communications, but they're in the midst of their merger with Time Warner Cable, and even though they have raised a lot of money to make that acquisition, it doesn't look like they'll participate, given that they're embroiled in that merger. Comcast, on the other hand, is represented by CC Wireless Investment on the list, and it's been widely recognized. They're looking to build a low-frequency canopy to provide coverage between their Wi-Fi hotspots. And this spectrum would do nicely. How much money they're going to spend? Keep in mind, Comcast is selling broadcast stations and buying back spectrum, probably with a multiple in between, right? So, they're going to be faced with that economic reality. But perhaps since they don't have any low-band spectrum, they will, even though they're a huge company, they will participate in the set-aside, because that's really the criteria for the set-aside. It's not the size of company. It's based on whether you have low-band spectrum. Dish looks like the only company we've been able to find that represents Dish, possibly, is a company called ParkerB.com, which is using a Dish address, at least. So we have to kind of investigate. The list just came out, so we're keeping our eyes on that. America Movil, which owns TracFone in the U.S., the largest MVNO, is bidding through its ownership of Puerto Rico Telephone. Claro is Puerto Rico Telephone in Puerto Rico. Whether they'll bid anywhere else, we don't know, but they filed as Puerto Rico Telephone. And even the Japanese mobile giant Docomo has filed as Docomo Pacific, which they own in Guam. Mm-hmm. the operator in Guam, which is a U.S. protectorate. So conceivable they could bid elsewhere, but more likely they'll just bid in Guam and take advantage of that. So these are the companies that we've been able to identify so far. Did we talk? Yeah, we talked about Dish. Yep. Oh, talk about the biggest company. How about Google? Is Google bidding?
There's no strict Google name right now. You're right, but it could be one of these hidden names. We don't know.
Well, I was looking for Alphabet.
There you go.
So, it's unclear as to whether Google's here somewhere, a shareholder, who knows. So, when you look down the list, there's over 100 companies on the list, but most of them are individual names you never heard of. So that kind of puts us there.
Yeah. It's definitely a very interesting list. But I guess as you look at this, do you have any expectations for those, I guess the companies we expect to bid? What's your kind of general overall view of how much you expect them to bid? I think we've talked in the past about expectations for the Verizons and AT&Ts and T-Mobiles of the world. What's your view on kind of what we might be looking for in terms of total bids here?
Well, the process of estimating the value of this auction and how much people are bid has gone through some cycles. There was some very high expectations early on, perhaps the end of last year, that this was an $80 billion auction, over $100 billion might come to play. Then it went way down, and a lot of the bidders were trying to reset expectations. And you saw all of our comments and our analysis, that companies like AT&T had already invested heavily, not only in spectrum, but they acquired DirecTV and have bought properties in Mexico. So they're really a bit overextended and may not be prepared to invest heavily in this auction. Maybe Verizon is going to, step back a bit and say, well, we're doing densification right now. Why should we invest in 600 megahertz? We don't need the coverage. We may need more spectrum for densification. T-Mobile perhaps has the biggest interest in this auction and wants to take advantage of the set-aside and get the best deal. And so perhaps they'll be the most aggressive. And their parent company has restated their support for them, so maybe they have some more capital to spend. But, we had originally estimated AT&T would spend about $10 billion, Verizon another $5 billion, T-Mobile another $8 billion. So it's hard to see how you get to big numbers given that. At the same time, the FCC published a very precise spreadsheet about the spectrum that's available and how much, if they could sell it all, and how much it would be worth. And it's huge. On the assumption that there were 80 megahertz of spectrum available with a population of 244 million, it was a much higher number, more on the order of 100 million. So when you look bottom up versus top down, you get very different results. So we're starting to swing the other way now. From Wireless 2020 perspective, we think we've gone through the period where the bidders were trying to short sell this auction and reset expectations. And now once we're really into it, once we have a better idea of what's for sale and what's available, we think we're going to end up with an auction that can raise somewhere between $50 and $60 billion.
Wow. And
we think that the average per megahertz pop could be in the $2.50 range. Whereas before we were looking at 30 to 35, $1.50 or $1.80 for per megahertz pop, we think it could be quite a bit bigger and quite a bit larger. Now, it'll depend, of course, on the appetite, on the willingness of non-carriers to invest heavily. That brings Comcast into the story, and certainly other dark horses, some of whom we haven't figured out who they are yet. But we do expect when you go bottom up, and once the auction fever starts, and the pot starts bubbling, we're going to see a lot more activity here, and it could drive the auction up to 50, 60 billion.
Very interesting. And again, I've talked to you guys in the past, and I've seen the models that you guys use there to kind of figure out values of spectrum. And so, I mean, again, I wouldn't argue with what you guys are putting out there, because it does seem like I've seen your models before, and that does seem to make sense. So, interesting to see what will come out of that then.
There's one more factor I want to introduce here, and I said it a bit earlier. You know, it's one thing to consider 600 megahertz to be a continuation of the pattern we've seen, auctions to deploy LTE spectrum. And, you know, we've seen what people are willing to pay to create LTE coverage and to get more capacity for LTE. But this spectrum will not be available at the earliest for 3 years. So we can talk a little bit in a minute about the timeline of availability and things like that. But in terms of its effect on the auction price, not only do these bidders have to anticipate that will be a complete change in technology, but it will be a complete change in paradigm. So 600 megahertz, as I said, sits on the cusp between 4G and 5G. So it's either the last 4G band that will be approved by 3GPP, and therefore kind of put the icing on the cake, or it'll really be the first band for 5G, in which you really want a layer of coverage that sits below all these small patches of high band spectrum that everybody's been talking about, that may have to be shared with other users, that may have to have certain special cases in order to make use of them. Everybody's trying to find new spectrum for 5G. Well, here is the beachfront property for 5G that allows you, for example, with applications in the IoT realm, to provide a layer of coverage for 5G that today you can't do this with LTE's technology. So in my view, if you're betting, I would more likely bet that this is a platform for the launch of 5G than the last spectrum for 4G. And that could set the whole price paradigm higher. If people are looking at the next 10 years, from 2020 to 2030, rather than the last 10 years, from 2010 to 2020, which is the period in which other auctions have taken place.
That's a great point, right? Because I know, I mean, the FCC chairman himself has mentioned that as throwing the 5G word into this this discussion quite often, that this could be a great start for that. And again, like you said, there is the repackaging timeline, which I believe is 39 months at this point, once the auction finishes, to actually get that spectrum away from broadcasters and into the hands of operators. And you're right, that looks like, you know, if this auction goes till the end of 2016 timeframe, that puts it right around that 2019, 2020 timeframe, which is the same one that we keep talking about for 5G. So you're right, it is, the timing of all this is very, very interesting at this point. And yeah, I mean, I guess it sounds like from your view at least, this is going to be maybe that first step towards 5G really in terms of spectrum usage.
I mean, since you and I spoke last, I was at Mobile World Congress. We all were. And in fact, I'm now heading toward all the 5G conferences coming up the rest of the year. So in this period between, you kind of have to think through what's going on. First of all the vendors have repositioned what they're selling as at least 5G ready. Mm-hmm. The word IoT has to be somewhere in the description of what they're offering, because that's what's coming to generate the revenues that will justify the investment both in the spectrum and in the equipment. So we are looking toward the future now. We're not building networks for yesterday or even tomorrow morning. You know, the concern about, you know, video performance and Netflix and the demand for traffic, that's going to be handled with densification. Mm-hmm. And that's going to be addressed through small cells and indoor deployments between now and then. When you get out to 2019 and 2020, you're really building the next generation of the mobile and wireless industry. And you have to think about what that architecture looks like, what spectrum bands are necessary. The FCC started that planning, but they've done so assuming that this auction is in the bank. This auction is done, and they're looking for the next wave of what spectrum they can make available, recognizing that 600 megahertz. And in my view, Wheeler has to look at his legacy. He delivered 600 megahertz as the platform, as the foundation for 5G. Sure, we have lots of other spectrum bands, even 28 gigahertz, right? Verizon's recent acquisition,
yep.
that we're going to get LMDS repurposed for 5G. But even recognizing that, that's 28 gigahertz. You know,
yep.
What's the coverage of 28 gigahertz versus what's the coverage of 600 megahertz? It's a completely different model. Now, one other thing, let's talk about this transition.
Yep.
Everybody's been debating, is 39 months a realistic time frame? Has the FCC been fully prepared to orchestrate this transition, and what's it going to take? So you've got, on the one hand, the mobile operators that are insisting that the discipline be imposed, that 39 months is the outside, date, not the least amount of time, but the most amount of time it could take. And in fact, they want to push the timeline back as far as they can. And they want the FCC to deliver them a realistic timetable for repacking so that they can be sure when should they deploy capital. They're spending money on the spectrum. They got to then deploy that spectrum. So they need a realistic plan. FCC has been involved in a very deep dive on this intensive planning process, and they keep reaffirming the 39-month schedule. At the other side, the NAB has been saying it's unrealistic. The broadcasters are going to need more time. They can't be disrupted in the business they're in. You can't just abruptly move them from here to there. There's a lot more preparation required. So there's a lot of this hemming and hawing going on. Now, if I were the NAB, I wouldn't blame them for doing this. At the same time, they're banking on selling this spectrum. And if they push the timeline out too far, from the wireless operator's perspective, why should I spend a lot of money on spectrum that is so far in the future I can't even plan for it? I can't even predict exactly what to do as far as deployment is concerned. So I think there has to be a balance struck here. The FCC has put a stake in the ground. They said 39 months. That still puts us into 2019, 2020. To me, that's 5G. And I think that sets a timeline that's, on the one hand, realistic and achievable. So I think we need to look at that going forward. And that has a big effect on how the bidders are going to view the auction process, which is the next thing that we have to worry about.
Yeah, good point. Well, maybe just a final wrap up then. I mean, it does seem like you are very, I would say, bullish at this point on this auction, at least being successful in terms of generating revenue for the FCC. Again, once all the repackaging things, that's a whole different story there. But it sounds like you guys are at least fairly bullish on the revenue part of it. I mean, what's maybe a broader general view from you guys on success of this, the timing of this? How should we kind of plan to from a media point of view? Should we plan to cover this thing going forward?
Well, one other thing, another kind of a dark horse looming here is the presidential election that's going on. And I can give you some wild scenarios. Put a little flavor. I'm not going to mention anybody's wife, but I will talk about the contrast between the candidates as far as how this auction might play out in the end when we're done. If Bernie Sanders were president, he might say, we're taking spectrum out of the public interest domain from broadcasters, and we're selling it to mobile operators who are going to commercialize it in another way, charge people for the use of that spectrum, charge subscribers. Maybe that's going to require another kind of rethink on the part of the Sanders administration in terms of what the purpose of this spectrum is and how the auction was conducted. And perhaps the government shouldn't be profiting from the purchase and sale of this spectrum, but in fact, we should be returning that to the people, being the Chinese capitalist that he is. The flip side of that is, perhaps if Donald Trump became president, he may decide that he would like to expedite the timeline for the FCC getting this done. He doesn't like the media anyway. Adversely affected, who cares? Let's get this spectrum out to the wireless industry as fast as possible. Let's shorten this time interval to 24 months while I'm still president. Wouldn't that be nice? So, I mean, you got some marks here on either side. Perhaps Hillary has a different view. Ted Cruz, who knows? I'm sure John Kasich has got a very balanced view, either this or that. But, we've got a presidential election going on in the backdrop to this auction, so we have to think about that. But from the way the bidders have to look at it, we've been through auctions before. The bidders kind of know how to do this. The law firms have taken them through, and consultants like ourselves have walked them through the simulations. They kind of are much more prepared than previous auctions to participate. But they do need to keep an eye. This is a very different auction. We need to look at the reverse auction as it unfolds. We need to watch carefully how much 600 megahertz spectrum is released, the degree of impairment across 400 PEAs, how much money the broadcasters get over 52 bidding rounds until we are declaring a provisional winner for each band. So that whole process that's going to take the month of April, people have to be very carefully watching how that unfolds. That'll set the stage. Once the FCC repacks, we need to be careful about how did they end up repacking? What ended up happening as they move the UHF band into another portion of the spectrum? And then they need to be prepared as bidders to have their auction team in place, their experts, the game theorists, the simulation, the competitive analysis necessary so that they're prepared for the forward auction, which will take place starting in June, running well into July. It's an arduous process. It requires a lot of commitment and not only capital, but just a lot of effort on their part. And it'll run through a lot of iterations. We won't know the outcome till it's done. And then the smaller bidders who are focusing on certain geographic areas, perhaps taking advantage of the set-aside, they need to be very surgically focused on how this all affects them. How does it affect their territory defensively and offensively? They need to protect themselves, but at the same time, they need to play their capital and their cards very carefully. So we think this is going to continue to be a very interesting process. We're looking forward to it, and we'll keep you posted as it unfolds.
That sounds great. I would definitely say this is definitely going to be one of the more complicated auctions, like you'd said. And so, yeah, I would say companies that perhaps don't have a huge staff set aside to focus specifically on this auction probably would be smart for them to get some outside assistance to make sure that they're focused in the right areas on this. Because, again, I think you've kind of laid out all the rules here. It's going to be a very complicated process with lots of moving parts that will tax any organization, no matter the size of it, but especially the smaller ones out there. It'll be big for them to make sure they've got people on their side to help them out with this.
I know we've staffed up to help our clients.
Yeah.
We added the former FCC Wireless Bureau Chief, Fred Campbell, to our team, and we're prepared to help our clients as much as possible. We've got all the auction simulation tools and the other predictive business case development tools. So, having the right tools and advisors on your side will really help.
Yeah, and I definitely recommend those if you're watching this, if you have some interest, go to the wireless2020.com site, get in contact with the guys there. You can contact Berge directly for either just some information on this or just some political commentary. Berge has got lots of insight into lots of things. Just ask him, he'll tell you. But you can reach Berge at wireless2020.com as well. But Berge, again, always appreciate the great insight on this. Again, this has been a exciting thing to kind of watch unfold, and I'm guessing the next few months will be even more exciting somehow for this. And hopefully we can touch base in between the reverse and forward auction process and kind of get a reset on where we are and maybe what to look forward to in the forward auction part of this. But we definitely, again, appreciate the great insight today. Well, thanks for watching this week's episode. Make sure to check back with RCR Wireless on a daily basis as we follow the FCC auction proceedings. And also make sure to check us out again next week for a new episode. Thanks for watching.